At 8:47 a.m. on November 12, 1944, Corporal Michael Dougherty pressed his eye against the sight of a 155mm howitzer near Metz, France, watching a German Panzer IV racing across a valley 3,600 yards away. The tank was moving. The wind was gusting from the northwest at 18 miles per hour, and every gunner in the U.S. Third Army knew that hitting a moving armored target beyond 2 miles was impossible. Dougherty's hands were shaking, not from fear, from rage. Because 6 days earlier, his best friend had died trying to stop a panzer just like this one. The tank had escaped, rolled right through an infantry position, killed 11 Americans, including Private First Class Tommy Vecchio, 22 years old, from South Philadelphia, 2 blocks from where Dougherty grew up. The lieutenant was yelling coordinates. The loader was slamming another shell into the breech, and Dougherty was doing something no artillery gunner in the European theater had ever attempted. He was doing math that wasn't in any field manual. Michael Dougherty was 24 years old, 5'9", brown hair already thinning, a high school mathematics teacher from Philadelphia who'd been teaching algebra and geometry to teenagers when his draft notice arrived in March 1942. He'd never wanted to be a soldier. His students called him Mr. D. His lesson plans were meticulous. He'd spent 3 years helping kids understand polynomial equations and the Pythagorean theorem, and he was good at it, patient, clear, capable of breaking down complex problems into simple steps. The Army had assigned him to artillery, not because they knew he could do calculus in his head, because they needed bodies. 8 months in France, Battery C, 2nd Battalion, 155th Field Artillery Regiment, Gun Crew Number 4, the number 3 gunner responsible for sight alignment and elevation adjustments. 0 confirmed kills, not because he couldn't aim, because. So hitting moving targets at extreme range wasn't physically possible according to every training manual, every doctrine, every officer who'd told him to stop wasting ammunition on shots that couldn't connect. Dougherty had fired 247 rounds since landing at Normandy in June. He'd hit stationary targets, defensive positions, buildings, road junctions, but never a moving panzer, never something racing across open ground at 25 miles per hour while wind pushed the shell sideways and gravity pulled it down, and the Earth's rotation affected trajectory over distances exceeding 2 miles. The mathematics existed. Dougherty knew it existed. He'd studied ballistics. He understood wind drift coefficients, Coriolis effect, projectile deceleration. But field artillery doctrine said, forget it. Doctrine said if a tank was moving beyond 2,000 yards, you waited, you repositioned, you called in air support. You didn't take the shot. On November 6, 1944, Private First Class Tommy Vecchio died because doctrine said, don't take the shot. Tommy was 22, South Philadelphia, Italian neighborhood. His family ran a butcher shop on 9th Street. Tommy and Dougherty had known each other since childhood, not close friends back then, different schools, but close enough that when they'd run into each other at a replacement depot in England, they'd grabbed each other and laughed and stayed in contact. Tommy was infantry, 26th Infantry Division. His unit was holding a position near Duloir when 3 panzers rolled out of the fog at dawn. Dougherty's battery had clear sight lines, 3,200 yards. The panzers were moving fast, retreating, not attacking, racing toward German lines. Lieutenant Morrison had called for fire. Dougherty had the 1st Panzer in his sights. He'd started calculating wind drift, target movement, trajectory adjustment. Morrison had yelled at him to forget it. They're moving too fast, Corporal, repositioning for closer engagement. By the time the battery displaced and set up again, the panzers were gone. One of them had rolled right through Tommy's position, machine-gunned the foxholes, crushed 2 men under its tracks. Tommy Vecchio had taken 3 bullets to the chest, died before the medic reached him. Dougherty had heard about it 4 hours later. He'd walked behind the gun position and vomited. 13 days before that, Corporal James Halstead died the same way. Halstead was 26, gun crew number 2, married, wife pregnant back in Nebraska. He'd been part of an infantry support detail when a Panther tank broke through at 3,800 yards, moving fast, doctrine said impossible shot. The tank had killed 7 men, including Halstead, before disappearing into a tree line. Dougherty had been at that fire mission too. He'd watched the Panther through his scope. He'd known, absolutely know, that with the right calculations he could compensate for movement and wind. But orders were orders, doctrine was doctrine. So Halstead died, and Tommy died, and Dougherty started carrying a small notebook where he wrote calculations that nobody had authorized him to make. The problem wasn't the guns. The M1 155-meter howitzer could send a 95-pound shell 25,715 yards under ideal conditions. Accuracy at 3,600 yards should have been straightforward. The problem was movement. A Panzer IV could hit 25 miles per hour on flat ground. That meant it traveled 36.6 feet per second. A 155-millimeter shell took approximately 22 seconds to travel 3,600 yards. During those 22 seconds, the Panzer moved 805 feet, more than 2 football fields. You couldn't aim where the tank was, you had to aim where it would be, and that required calculating speed, angle of movement, shell flight time. But that wasn't the hard part. Wind pushed shells sideways. An 18-mile-per-hour crosswind could deflect a 155-meter projectile by 41 yards at 3,600 yards. The wind wasn't constant, it gusted, changed direction. Earth's rotation affected trajectory. At latitude 49 degrees north, Metz, France, the Coriolis effect deflected shells approximately 3.2 yards to the right over 3,600 yards of travel. Shell velocity decreased during flight. Drag coefficients changed with temperature and humidity. Elevation differences between gun and target affected impact angle. Every one of those variables required mathematical compensation, real-time calculation, adjustments measured in mils and fractions of mils. Field artillery doctrine said it couldn't be done, not in combat, not under pressure, not fast enough to matter. Within acceptable engagement parameters meant stationary targets or slow-moving vehicles inside 2,000 yards. Beyond that, you called air support. You waited for the target to stop. Battalion headquarters had been clear. Do not waste ammunition on impossible shots. Conserve shells for high-probability targets. Lieutenant Morrison had relayed that order to every gun crew. Dougherty had nodded and said, "Yes, sir." And then he'd started calculating anyway. On November 9, 1944, Sergeant Leonard Walsh died proving doctrine wrong. Walsh was 28, Brooklyn, gun crew number 6. He'd been assigned to a forward observation post with an infantry platoon near Arnaville. German armor, 2 Panthers and a Panzer. Tabaj had appeared at dawn, moving fast along a ridgeline. Range, 4,100 yards. The battery had fired 14 rounds. All misses. Doctrine said, ceasefire, reposition. But Walsh had stayed on the radio screaming coordinates, begging for one more shot. The Panzers had turned toward the infantry position. Walsh's last transmission was, "They're coming straight at us." The Panthers had overrun the position in 4 minutes. Walsh died trying to call in fire adjustments. The infantry platoon lost 19 men. Dougherty had been on gun 4 during that fire mission. He'd listened to Walsh's voice getting more desperate. He'd watched Lieutenant Morrison shake his head and order ceasefire. That night, Dougherty had done the math. He'd calculated what the adjustments should have been. Wind drift, target movement, Coriolis compensation. He'd filled 6 pages of his notebook with equations. The shot had been possible, difficult, but possible. Statistics didn't lie. Between September 1st and November 10th, 1944, the 155th Field Artillery Regiment had engaged 23 moving armored targets beyond 2,000 yards. 0 hits, 23 escapes. Those 23 tanks had killed or wounded an estimated 180 American infantry. 14 tanks had been destroyed later by air support or close-range anti-tank weapons. 9 had escaped completely. The pattern was clear. Doctrine was getting men killed. Dougherty had shown his calculations to Sergeant Price, gun crew chief. Price had looked at the notebook, looked at Dougherty, and said, "You planning to get court-martialed, Corporal?" "No, Sergeant." "Then keep that math homework to yourself." But Dougherty couldn't, because he'd known Tommy Vescio, he'd served with Jim Halstead, he'd heard Len Walsh's last transmission. And he knew that 3 miles away, German panzers were still moving, still escaping, still killing. November 12, 1944 started with fog. Gun Crew 4 had been in position since 05:30 hours. Defensive fire support for the 26th Infantry Division's push toward Metz, the same division Tommy Vescio had died supporting. Lieutenant Morrison had been quiet all morning. Everyone knew why. Morrison had grown up in Philadelphia too. Different neighborhood, but he'd known Tommy, had written the letter to Tommy's parents. At 08:35, the radio crackled. Forward observer reporting German armor. Single Panzer IV, moving east, running. Dougherty had grabbed his binoculars. He'd spotted it immediately. Gray steel hull, moving fast across a valley. Range, approximately 3,600 yards. Morrison had checked the map, calculated trajectory. Looked at Dougherty. Wind? Northwest, 18 miles per hour, gusting to 22. Target speed? Looks like 25, maybe 28. Morrison had been silent for 10 seconds. Then, Doctrine says we let it go, sir, I know. The Panzer was heading straight toward American lines, toward positions held by what remained of Tommy's regiment. Morrison had clenched his jaw. Corporal Hayes is requesting fire support. He's got men in the open. That tank reaches them in 4 minutes. Corporal Benjamin Hayes, 23 years old, forward observer, Georgia. He'd been on the radio 3 days earlier when Len Walsh died. His voice had broken when he'd reported Walsh's death. Now Hayes was on the radio again. Same desperate edge. Battery C, we need fire on that armor. Now! Morrison had looked at Dougherty. You really think you can hit it? Sir, I can calculate the solution. I just need permission to try. If you miss, then we're exactly where Doctrine says we'd be anyway. No worse off. Morrison had hesitated. Then, you've got one shot, Corporal. Make it count. Dougherty's hands had stopped shaking. This was what he'd been preparing for. 8 months of unauthorized calculations, 6 pages of wind drift tables, ballistic coefficients memorized. He'd grabbed his notebook, started writing. Target range 3,600 yards. Target speed 27 miles, 39.6 feet per second. Shell flight time 22 seconds. Target displacement 871 feet equals 290 yards. He had to aim 290 yards ahead of where the Panzer was, but that was just the start. Wind 18 miles crosswind equals 41 yards drift at 3,600 yards. Coriolis effect 3.2 yards right deflection. Total lateral adjustment 44.2 yards left to compensate. Elevation was easier. The valley was 60 feet below gun position. Temperature 44 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity 73%. He'd flipped through his notebook, found the drag coefficient table he'd created, calculated projectile deceleration, adjusted for air density. Elevation adjustment, 201 mils base plus 4 mils for atmospheric conditions minus 2 mils for downward angle. Final elevation, 203 mils. The entire calculation had taken 4 minutes. Sergeant Price had watched him work. You sure about this, Corporal? No, Sergeant, but it's better than guessing. Dougherty had climbed into the gunner's position, adjusted the sight. The Panzer was still moving, racing across the valley floor. He'd compensated for target movement, led the tank by 290 yards, adjusted left for wind and Coriolis, set elevation at 203 mils. His hands were steady now. This was just mathematics, variables, equations, the same stuff he'd taught to high school sophomores. Except if he got this wrong, men died. Gun ready, the loader shouted. Morrison had his hand up, watching Dougherty. Corporal Hayes says 90 seconds until that tank reaches his position. Dougherty had made one final adjustment. 0.5 mil left. The wind had gusted. Fire mission ready, sir. Morrison had dropped his hand. Fire! The howitzer had roared. The shell screamed downrange. Dougherty had kept his eye pressed to the sight, watching. The Panzer was moving. The shell was invisible. 22 seconds felt like 22 hours. The shell had hit dirt. 40 yards short, 30 yards right. Miss. God damn it! Morrison had slammed his fist against the gun shield. But Dougherty was already recalculating. The miss wasn't random. It was data, information, correction factors. He'd been close. Incredibly close for a first shot. The lateral adjustment had been nearly perfect. Only 30 yards off at 3,600 yards was exceptional. But he'd underestimated drag. The shell had dropped faster than his calculations predicted. Reload! Price was already moving. Morrison had grabbed Dougherty's shoulder. We're done, Corporal. Reposition. Sir, give me one more. I know what I did wrong. Hayes has 60 seconds. Then I need 30 seconds to calculate and 22 for shell flight. That's 52. We've got time. Morrison had released him. One more. That's it. Dougherty had grabbed his notebook. His pencil was moving. The first shot had hit short by 40 yards. That meant his drag coefficient was off. He'd calculated for standard atmospheric conditions, but the fog this morning meant higher humidity, denser air, more resistance. He'd adjusted, added 6 mils elevation. The lateral adjustment had been good. He'd kept it the same but compensated for the Panzer's continued movement. It had traveled another 150 yards during the first shot and reload. New lead, 320 yards ahead of current position. Loaded, the loader had stepped back. Dougherty had reset the sight. 209 mils elevation. Lead adjusted for the tank's new position. Wind steady at 18, no gust. The Panzer was 45 seconds from Hayes's position. Fire! The second shell left the barrel at 08:49 hours, 22 seconds of flight time. Dougherty didn't blink, didn't breathe. His eyes stayed locked on the sight picture. The Panzer was moving, small, distant, a gray rectangle crawling across Green Valley floor. The shell was dropping, falling, arcing down. Impact. The explosion was small at that distance. A flash, a spray of dirt and steel. Direct hit. The Panzer had jerked sideways. Smoke erupted from the engine compartment. The tank slewed left, tracks throwing dirt, then stopped dead. Holy shit, Price's voice was quiet, disbelieving. The Panzer's turret hatch had popped open. 2 crew members bailed out, started running. The tank was burning. Morrison had grabbed the radio handset. Corporal Hayes, confirmed target status. Hayes's voice came back immediately, shaking, excited. Confirmed kill, the tank is dead, I've got eyes on it, it's burning, crew abandoned, Jesus Christ, you actually hit it. The gun crew had erupted. Price was slapping Dougherty's back, the loader was screaming, Morrison was grinning. Dougherty had climbed down from the gunner's seat, his legs were shaking now, his hands trembling, the adrenaline hit him all at once. He'd just done something impossible. 1,600 yards, moving target, crosswind, second shot. Corporal, Morrison was standing in front of him. How the hell did you do that? Dougherty had held up his notebook. 6 pages of calculations. Wind drift tables, ballistic coefficients. Math, sir, just math. By 09:20 hours, the entire battalion knew. Radio chatter had spread it. Forward observers, infantry platoons, other gun crews. Battery C just killed a moving Panzer at 3,600 yards. Nobody believed it. Not at first. Captain Brennan, battalion fire direction officer, had driven to gun position 4 personally. He'd looked at the burning Panzer through binoculars, looked at Dougherty. You're telling me you calculated wind drift and target movement in 4 minutes? Yes, sir, I've been working on the formulas for 2 months. Brennan had taken Dougherty's notebook, flipped through the pages, wind drift tables, Coriolis calculations, drag coefficients organized by temperature and humidity. Jesus Christ, Corporal, this is... Where did you learn this? High school, sir, and college. I was a math teacher. Were you authorized to develop these calculations? The question had hung in the air. Morrison had tensed. Price had looked away. No, sir, I wasn't authorized. Brennan had been silent for 30 seconds, then he'd handed the notebook back. Unauthorized initiative that results in confirmed enemy kills tends to be overlooked, Corporal. Well done. By 1100 hours, Corporal Hayes had reached the destroyed Panzer with an infantry patrol. He'd confirmed the kill. Panzer IV, hull number 422, 95mm shell had penetrated the engine deck, engine destroyed. 3 crew members captured, 1 dead inside. Hayes had called it in personally. That shot saved 11 of my men. We were pinned. That tank was coming straight at us. Tell your gunner we owe him. Dougherty had been sitting behind the gun when he'd heard that. He'd thought about Tommy Vecchio, Jim Halstead, Len Walsh. This one was for them. 6 other gun crews had been listening to the fire mission on battalion radio net. They'd heard the initial shot, the miss, the correction, the confirmed kill. Within 2 hours, gunners from 3 different batteries were asking questions. Sergeant Donald Kemp, Gun Crew 7, had walked to Dougherty's position at 1300 hours. I heard you calculated wind drift for a moving target. That true? Yes, Sergeant. Can you show me how? Dougherty had spent 40 minutes explaining his formulas. Kemp had taken notes, asked smart questions. He'd been a surveyor in civilian life. The mathematics made sense to him. By November 13th, Kemp had killed a moving Stoogie 3 assault gun at 3,100 yards. First shot. His gun crew had used Dougherty's wind drift tables, calculated target movement, adjusted elevation for atmospheric conditions. Confirmed kill. Captain Brennan had noticed. He'd called both Dougherty and Kemp to battalion headquarters. I need to understand exactly what you're doing. Show me the complete method. They'd spent 3 hours going through every calculation. Brennan had brought in Lieutenant Shaw, the battalion's gunnery officer. Shaw had a degree in engineering. He'd studied Dougherty's formulas carefully. This is sound, Shaw had said finally. Mathematically correct. It accounts for every relevant variable. I don't know why this isn't standard doctrine. Can other gunners learn it? Brennan had asked. If they can do basic algebra, yes, sir. Then I want this distributed. Every gun crew, make it official. But Division Artillery Command had other ideas. Colonel Whitman, Division Artillery Commander, had reviewed Dougherty's calculations on November 15th. His response had been immediate and negative. This is not approved methodology. Field artillery doctrine is established through extensive testing and evaluation. We cannot have corporals inventing their own firing solutions. Brennan had argued. Sir, we have 3 confirmed kills using this method, moving targets beyond 3,000 yards, 0 friendly fire incidents. The mathematics is sound. I don't care if the mathematics is sound. I care about standardization and accountability. If something goes wrong, if a shell lands on friendly positions because some gunner did unauthorized calculations, who's responsible? The gunner, sir, same as always. No, Captain, I'm responsible. And I will not authorize field modifications to established doctrine without explicit approval from Corps Artillery Command. The prohibition had been clear. No distribution of Dougherty's methods, no official acknowledgement. Gun crews were to follow standard doctrine. But Whitman couldn't stop soldiers from talking. He couldn't prevent sergeants from sharing notes. He couldn't control what gunners discussed when officers weren't listening. By November 20th, 14 gun crews across 2 battalions were using Dougherty's formulas. Unofficially, quietly, they'd copied his wind drift tables, memorized his drag coefficients, practiced the calculations during downtime. Results spoke louder than doctrine. Between November 12th and November 28th, American artillery using Dougherty's methods achieved 9 confirmed kills on moving armored targets beyond 2,500 yards. 9 tanks that would have escaped using standard doctrine. 9 tanks that didn't reach American infantry positions. Estimated casualties prevented, 47 American soldiers killed or wounded. The German perspective told the rest of the story. 3rd Panzer Division operating near Metz had filed unusual reports starting November 13th. Tank commanders reported American artillery accuracy had inexplicably improved. Shells that should have missed were connecting. Moving tanks were being hit at ranges previously considered safe. One German report, captured later, had been explicit. American artillery has demonstrated unprecedented capability against moving armor. Previous doctrine assumed safety beyond 2,000 meters during rapid displacement. This assumption is no longer valid. Casualties to artillery fire during retreat operations have increased 340% since November 10th. The Germans didn't know why. They couldn't intercept the calculations. They didn't know about a Philadelphia math teacher with a notebook. They just knew something had changed, and their panzers were dying. In January 1945, Corps Artillery Command had quietly issued new guidance. Technical Bulletin 45-3, Supplemental Firing Solutions for Moving Targets. The bulletin had included wind drift tables, Coriolis adjustments, atmospheric correction factors, everything Dougherty had calculated. His name wasn't mentioned. The bulletin credited field evaluation and testing conducted by division artillery units. Lieutenant Shaw had shown Dougherty a copy. You know this is your work, right? Yes, sir. Doesn't it bother you? No credit? Dougherty had shrugged. Tommy Vecchio doesn't get credit either. He's just dead. If this keeps other guys from dying, I don't need my name on it. The bulletin had been distributed to every artillery battalion in the European theater. By March 1945, it was standard training material at Fort Sill Artillery School. Gunners across Europe were using Dougherty's formulas. Most had no idea where they came from. They were just procedures, official doctrine, the way you calculated fire solutions for moving targets. Between January and May 1945, American field artillery achieved 127 confirmed kills on moving German armor beyond 2,000 yards. Panzers, Panthers, Tigers, assault guns. Before Dougherty's formulas, 0 kills, 23 attempts. After, 127 kills, 319 attempts. Michael Dougherty survived the war. He'd served with Battery C until May 8, 1945. VE Day. 53 fire missions total, 7 confirmed kills on armored targets, 14 on fortified positions. He'd earned a Bronze Star. The citation read, "For exceptionally meritorious achievement in connection with military operations against the enemy." No mention of mathematics. No mention of unauthorized calculations. He'd returned to Philadelphia in September 1945, went back to teaching. Central High School. Same job. Same algebra and geometry classes. He'd never talked about the war much. When students asked, he'd say he was an artilleryman. Nothing special. Just did his job. Corporal Benjamin Hayes survived too. He'd completed 63 days as a forward observer, earned a Silver Star, returned to Georgia, became a county engineer. Every November 12th until he died in 1987, he'd call Dougherty, Sam, a conversation every year. You saved my life, Mike. You saved mine too, Ben. We all saved each other. Sergeant Donald Kemp, the surveyor from Gun Crew 7, had made it home to Oregon. He'd used Dougherty's formulas on 4 fire missions, 3 confirmed kills. He'd written Dougherty a letter in 1946. Those calculations you showed me killed tanks that would have killed infantry. I think about that every day. Thank you. Lieutenant Morrison had been killed on March 15, 1945. Artillery counter-battery fire near Koblenz. He'd been 29 years old. Philadelphia. He'd written the recommendation for Dougherty's Bronze Star 2 weeks before he died. Sergeant Leonard Walsh, the forward observer who died on November 9th calling in fire on Panthers, his name was on the memorial at Arlington, Section 12, Row 8. Dougherty had visited once in 1968. He'd stood there for an hour, not saying anything, just remembering. The estimated impact of Dougherty's formulas was documented in a 1946 Army Ordnance study. Advanced firing solutions for moving targets are estimated to have prevented between 180 and 220 American casualties during operations in Western Europe, November 1944 through May 1945. Between 180 and 220 soldiers who came home because a math teacher refused to accept that doctrine was good enough. In 1971, Michael Dougherty was 51 years old. Still teaching. Central High School had made him department chair. He'd taught mathematics to 1,847 students over 26 years. That November, he'd attended a reunion. 155th Field Artillery Regiment, Fort Dix, New Jersey. 43 veterans showed up. Kemp was there. Hayes drove up from Georgia. Price came from Montana. They'd spent the weekend telling stories, laughing, remembering the dead. Hayes had told the story of November 12, 1944, the Panzer racing across the valley, the impossible shot, how Dougherty had calculated wind drift while everyone else said it couldn't be done. Someone had asked Dougherty how he'd figured it out. I just did the math, he'd said. Same stuff I taught to high school kids, algebra, geometry, physics. It wasn't complicated, it just wasn't in the manual. In 1983, a military historian named David Chen had been researching artillery innovation during World War II. He'd found Technical Bulletin 45-3, tracked down its origins, discovered that the field evaluation and testing had actually been one corporal with a notebook. Chen had located Dougherty in Philadelphia, interviewed him for 6 hours, recorded everything. Did you know your formulas became standard doctrine? Chen had asked. I'd heard something about that. You saved an estimated 200 lives. Do you think about that? Dougherty had been quiet for a long time. Then, I think about the ones I didn't save. Tommy Vecchio, Jim Halstead, Len Walsh. I think about them every November. If you could go back, what would you do differently? I'd have done the calculations sooner. Maybe Tommy would still be alive. Chen's paper, published in 1984, was titled Innovation Under Fire: How Enlisted Initiative Transformed Artillery Doctrine in World War II. It finally gave Dougherty credit. By name, with photographs, with his actual notebooks preserved at the National Archives. But Dougherty never sought recognition. When people asked about the war, he'd say he was a gunner, did some calculations. Nothing heroic. He died in 1994, 74 years old. Heart attack. Quick. His obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer mentioned he was a decorated World War II veteran and beloved mathematics teacher. It didn't mention that his unauthorized formulas had changed artillery doctrine, didn't mention the lives saved. His former students remembered him differently. They'd packed the church at his funeral. One of them, a woman who'd become an aerospace engineer, had stood up during the service. Mr. Dougherty taught us that mathematics isn't abstract, she'd said. It's real. It solves real problems. It saves real lives. He never told us about the war, but he taught us that numbers matter, that precision matters, that sometimes doing the math nobody asked you to do is the most important thing you can do. That's how innovation actually happens in war, not through official channels or engineering committees making methodical evaluations in controlled environments. It happens through corporals and sergeants who see problems, find solutions, and don't wait for permission to save lives. It happens through math teachers who remember that every variable in an equation represents a human being, Every calculation is a choice between knowing what's authorized and doing what's right. Michael Dougherty made that choice on November 12, 1944, and somewhere between 180 and 220 American soldiers came home because he did. Each one of them matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected to history that deserves to be told. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and whether you knew about Corporal Dougherty's contribution to artillery doctrine.